They said the bells had rung themselves hoarse before the man in the beaked mask came to us, that the rope had frayed from the weight of so many tolls for the dead. The year was 1656, though the dates had ceased to matter in a village, where time was measured only by the number of bodies taken before dawn. The air clung to the skin like wet linen, heavy with the scent of rot, and something acrid, like burned herbs, though none of us had lit fires for weeks for fear the smoke would draw the wandering thieves. It was on such a day that he arrived, walking alone through the mist, his silhouette long and thin, the beak of his mask pointing downward as though it studied the earth with sorrow or hunger. He was clad in black leather from head to toe, but unlike the plain garb of the plague doctors we had heard of, his coat bore strange seams that crossed like scars, stitched with a thread the color of dried blood. In his left hand he carried a cane of polished wood, in his right a bag that swayed with a faint but unmistakable sound, the rustle of something alive. 2 figures followed him, silent and hooded, each bearing a small wooden cage. The villagers watched from windows, from doorways, from behind half-closed shutters. Children were yanked back into rooms before they could see too much. No one greeted him, yet no one barred his way. We were desperate, and desperation is the weakest lock in the world. He went first to the church, though the priest had been buried 3 days past. He stood before the altar, bowing slightly, then unpacked his tools onto the wood. Needles longer than a man's finger, curved like the talons of a hawk, spools of coarse thread, small, cruel scissors, a row of tiny blades, and from his bag, wrapped in burlap, came a rat, its fur mottled and eyes bright with a restless gleam. Without a word, he took it to the corpse of a man who had died that morning. We had left him on the altar because the gravediggers were too few and the earth too frozen. The doctor drew his blade, opened a seam along the man's side, and, with a precision both deliberate and obscene, slid the rat inside. He stitched the wound shut, each pull of the thread making the rat within squirm, the flesh rippling unnaturally. A woman gasped, and someone crossed themselves so fast the beads of their rosary snapped. Still, he spoke no word, only turned to us and inclined his head as though expecting thanks. At last he spoke, his voice muffled through the mask, yet strangely clear. The vermin will drink the blackness, the vessel will be purified. He left the corpse where it lay and departed to the home of a sick child. Some followed, others fled. I followed. The girl lay fevered, her lips cracked, her eyes glazed. Her mother begged him to save her. Again he drew out a rat, this one smaller, its tail twitching. With a deftness that suggested years of such work, he made a small incision at the child's thigh and nestled the rat within. Its squeaks muffled almost at once. He stitched the skin shut, patted the wound as one might soothe a restless animal, and told the mother to keep the girl warm. By dawn the child was dead, her legs swollen, the stitches torn from within. He did not call it failure, only a necessary trial. Some vessels cannot hold the cure, he murmured. The villagers whispered that he was mad, or a sorcerer, or worse, but others, their eyes red from weeping, saw in him the last hope we had. The next day, more came to him, offering their sick, and the beaked doctor, whom I later learned was named Leonhard Silvius, began his work in earnest. The sound of his needle pulling through flesh becoming as common in our streets as the tolling of the death bell. It was on the 4th day that I began to notice the smell, not the rot of the sick. No, that had long since become the very perfume of our village, but a sharper, stranger scent, as if damp. Straw had been soaked in blood and left to sour. It came from the houses where Silvius had worked, and though the people whispered, none dared open the stitches to see what festered within. He moved from home to home without rest, the bag at his side never empty, as if the rats were given to him by some unseen supplier, or bred in the shadows of his quarters, for no one could say where he slept. Sometimes, in the still hours before dawn, I heard the sound of small claws against cobblestone, scurrying not away from the plague but toward it, as if drawn by a promise. His 2 silent attendants, whom I had yet to see unmasked, never spoke, never ate in public, and never touched the sick themselves. They only held the cages, the creatures within seeming unnaturally docile until the moment they were placed in human flesh, when they became fevered with movement. I saw a boy named Mathiono more than 12 crawl from his bed 2 nights after Silvius had visited him. His mother found him in the street, tearing at his own side with broken fingernails, shrieking in a voice not his own. By the time we reached him, the wound had opened, and from it, the rat burst forth, slick with blood, vanishing into the night while the boy fell silent forever. Silvius examined the corpse without alarm, muttering something about the host rejecting the vessel before moving on to the next patient. The villagers were torn between horror and a terrible gratitude, for though many died, there were whispers, yes, whispers that a few had lived. Old Marth, who had been on her deathbed for weeks, now walked the streets pale but breathing. Her eyes, however, seemed wrong, catching the light in a way that made people turn from her. Little, once fevered and delirious, now spoke clearly, though she spent hours each day crouched in the corners of her home, listening for something no one else could hear. I asked Silvius how he chose who to treat, and he fixed me with the dark lenses of his mask. "I do not choose," he said. "They choose. The rats know." That night, I dreamt of the doctor's hands, long and bone-white, sewing not flesh to flesh but man to beast, as though mending a garment whose pattern only he understood. I woke to find scratches on my door, deep and fresh, though no animal tracks marked the snow. As the days stretched on, the plague itself seemed to change. The swellings blackened faster, the fevers rose higher, but some victims, instead of dying, would fall into a strange half-sleep, their breathing shallow, their skin cold, their lips moving as if murmuring to something just beneath the surface. Silvius called these the in-between, and tended them most attentively, often spending hours beside their beds with his gloved hand resting over the stitched wound, as though feeling for a heartbeat that was not their own. I began to suspect his purpose was not to cure in the way we understood it. One evening, when the snow fell so thick it muffled every sound, I followed him. Through alleys and over frozen canals, I trailed the three figures, my breath fogging the air, until they came to the old granary at the edge of the village. Inside, by the dim light of a single lantern, I saw them open the bodies of the in-between, not to remove the rats, but to replace them, one creature for another, as though testing combinations. The floor writhed with those that had been removed, their eyes bright, their tails slick, their small mouths moving in unison, as if reciting a prayer in some rodent tongue. I left before they saw me, but the image clung to my mind like frostbite. I realized then that whatever salvation Silvius promised, it was not meant for us. It was meant for them. The winter deepened, and with it, so did the grip of Silvius over our village. He no longer needed to knock upon the doors of the dying. The dying were brought to him bundled in blankets, their families begging at the threshold of whatever place he chose to set up his work for the day. The granary was abandoned now, for I suspected it had served its purpose. Instead, he worked in the old chapel, a stone building whose altar had been stripped bare, where the air was colder inside than out, and where the saints, carved in wood along the walls, seemed to avert their gaze. Here, under the vaulted shadows, the sound of his needle and thread echoed like the ticking of a clock counting down to some grim conclusion. I came one night to see a man Henry the blacksmith strapped to the altar itself, his massive frame trembling as the doctor worked on his side. The wound was long and cruel, and into it Silvius lowered a rat whose fur was slick as oil, its eyes too large for its head, watching the man as it disappeared into him. The stitching was slow, deliberate, each pass of the needle pulling Henry tighter to his fate. When it was done, Silvius whispered into the blacksmith's ear, and whatever he said made the man's sobs stop instantly. Henry left the chapel that night walking upright, though his gait had changed. He favored his left leg and kept his head low, as if listening to some secret sound beneath the earth. Over the weeks that followed, more and more of the in-between walked among us. They rarely spoke to anyone but one another, gathering in small groups in the alleys or down by the frozen river. I saw them once at dusk, lined up along the water's edge, unmoving for so long that snow began to gather upon their shoulders. When I called out to Marth, who stood among them, she turned her head in perfect unison with the others, and though her lips did not move, I heard faint but certain the chittering of rats. By then, the healthy had begun to leave, trudging into the frozen countryside, preferring the risk of the road to the presence of the doctor's growing congregation. I might have joined them, but something in me needed to see where this path led, as if the story itself had trapped me. My chance came when I was summoned not by illness, but by name to the chapel. Silvius stood over a boy on the altar, no older than 8, whose skin was as pale as wax. His wound was fresh, his breath shallow, and yet the doctor was not sewing. Instead, he beckoned me closer, pressing something small and warm into my palm. I looked down to see a rat, alive but unnaturally still, its body rising and falling with a slow, deliberate rhythm. "It has chosen you," Sylvia said. I tried to drop it, but my fingers would not obey. Panic rose in my chest as the creature's tiny claws gripped my skin, not in desperation but in certainty, as though it knew it belonged there. The doctor leaned close enough that I could smell the herbs in his mask. "This is not plague," he whispered. "This is passage." I fled the chapel, the rat still clinging to my hand, and did not stop until I reached my home. Only when I slammed the door and pressed my back against it did the creature loosen its grip and crawl away into the shadows, leaving a trail of warmth along my skin. That night, I could not sleep. I heard scratching in the walls, the floorboards, even in the rafters above my bed. It was not the frantic scurry of vermin, but a slow, deliberate movement, like the pacing of a sentry. In the morning, when I stepped outside, I saw Silvius at the far end of the street, his masked face turned toward me. Though we were a dozen houses apart, I knew by some instinct I could not name that he was smiling beneath that beak. And I understood then that whatever was happening was no longer confined to the dying. It had come for the living. The days after that were unlike any I had known, though the snow still fell and the smoke still rose from the few chimneys left in the village. I began to notice the rats in places they had never been before, perched atop fence posts, clustered beneath the eaves of houses, watching with the stillness of statues. Those who had received Silvius's treatment no longer tried to hide the seams in their flesh. Some even left the stitches uncovered, the puckered skin framing the dark gap through which something moved beneath. At night, faint squeals echoed from inside those wounds, and the air carried a musk that clung to the back of the throat. On the seventh night, I woke to find my front door ajar, snow drifting over the threshold. In the center of the room stood Henry, the blacksmith, his chest bare, the stitches along his ribs glistening in the firelight. He spoke without moving his lips, the words forming in my mind, as if whispered from some hidden chamber within him. "It is time." I followed him into the streets, where others were gathering, dozens, then hundreds, more than I thought the village still held. They moved as one body, their steps silent despite the snow. At the head of this procession was Silvius, his mask gleaming in the moonlight, his gloved hands folded behind his back. He led us beyond the houses, past the frozen fields, to the granary where it had all begun. The great doors were open now, and inside, the air was warm and wet, smelling of earth after rain. I saw no grain within, only a floor alive with movement. Rats, thousands of them, covered every surface, their bodies weaving and writhing until the eye could no longer distinguish one from another. Silvius stepped into their midst, and the swarm parted for him like water. He turned to face us and removed his mask for the first time. His face was not diseased, nor was it human. The skin was hairless and pale, the eyes black and without whites, the mouth a narrow slit that did not move when he spoke. "The sickness you feared was never meant to kill," the voice said, not from his lips, but from everywhere at once, from the walls, the floor, the swarm itself. It was meant to open the door. Then the in-between stepped forward, each unthreading their wounds with calm precision. From within their bodies, rats emerged not in panic, but with the slow certainty of creatures returning home. The air grew thick with the sound of claws on wood and the musk of their fur. I tried to turn away, to flee, but my body would not obey. A warmth spread through my chest, and I looked down to see the stitches, their stitches I had no memory of receiving, drawn tight over a swelling beneath my skin. Silvius approached, his eyes fixed upon me, and I felt the movement inside grow stronger, urgent. "Do not fear it," the voice said. "It only wishes to see the world." The last thing I remember is the sound of fabric tearing from within, and the sudden, dizzying rush of being both inside myself and somewhere far beyond, carried on a tide of darkness and teeth. When I awoke, it was spring. The village was empty, the doors swinging open in the wind. The snow melted into streams that carried with them the small, clean-picked bones of things that had once been whole. I never saw Silvius again, though sometimes, when the night is quiet, I hear the measured scratching in the walls, and know that whatever door he opened has never truly closed.